let's first move into Bitcoin. So many of you have been asking, where we see Bitcoin going from here. And I've always stayed away from short-term price forecasts and price speculation. So what I'm going to try and do is give you some of my perspectives in terms of the fundamentals of Bitcoin, so that we can, you can take some of that and you can make your own conclusions about what it is. But from my perspective, Bitcoin took a huge, a huge hit in the market just with everything else. It still outperformed many other asset classes. But many people started to question whether Bitcoin is a safe haven or not. And I think this comes down to your definition of safe haven. Bitcoin is not a safe haven from everything. The way that I see Bitcoin is what's known as a speculative store of value, which means that there is speculative opportunities on whether it will become a store of value, because a store of value is an asset class like gold, which people use in order to preserve wealth, not as an investment in order to increase wealth. And at the moment, many people use Bitcoin as an asset to increase wealth, but depending on your short-term timing and whether you're trading or not, that may or may not be the case. What I see Bitcoin as is a hedge against a financial uncertainty. And by financial uncertainty, I mean the fact that Bitcoin gives you the ability to own your own money, spend your own money, and has a fixed supply. I think that it's counter to anything that helps people understand that when they deposit their money in a bank, they don't own their money. That sometimes in times like this, you may not be able to spend your money the way you choose. And that except in times of health crisis, when the government have to go all out in order to get through the crisis, they do excessive money printing as a way of funding their recovery plans, and therefore the supply increases, which is the opposite of what you see in Bitcoin. So when there's an initial shock, like a health crisis, which that we're all in right now, Bitcoin will obviously be more effective as people move towards cash. They'll sell their Bitcoin, they'll sell their stocks, they'll sell their shares, they'll try and sell their property, but it's not liquid enough. There'll be a movement towards cash. Eventually, that cash that starts to flood the system in times like we are in today, I believe that people, when governments are doing things like helicopter money, people are going to be very conservative with what they do with their funds. And I'm forecasting that a lot of people in this time of lockdown will be deciding not to pay their mortgage. They'll say that they would rather have the cash than give the mortgage, and therefore that can trigger a bank crisis. The financial crisis is inevitable. If you've been watching any of my videos over the years since I started on YouTube over 10 years ago, before Bitcoin started, when there is defaults on mortgages, that can cause people to really understand that banks will implement different policies in order to avoid a run on the bank. And therefore, people start to see that they don't own their own money, they can't spend their own money, and eventually you get the effects of the excessive money printing. And therefore, Bitcoin, I believe, will be in demand. And this does relate to some of the other industries that we're seeing, and I'll save that for when we cover those crypto exchanges and crypto mining. But I am forecasting an increase in people understanding not just how to make money from Bitcoin, but how to use the utility of Bitcoin. And I think eventually that will be reflected in the price. So for me, I think that investors in BnkToTheFuture that have been investing in the infrastructure to help support the birth of the growth, or the growth of the Bitcoin industry, that Bitcoin will still become more and more useful to more and more people. And therefore, I am long-term bullish, as I have always been since the beginning. So the first thing is, I do expect that we may have one more little, a crash in us, but I'm expecting, personally, I'm buying into the dips here, and I'm expecting a longer-term bullish trend. Obviously, things can change. But I think that Bitcoin is an incredibly useful asset class in times of uncertainty. Adam, you got anything to say on Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is, in 10 years or so, since the beginning of Bitcoin, it's taken a long time for people to even understand what Bitcoin is and what, the derivative of it is blockchain technology. So if we were at the time of the financial crisis in, say, 2008, trying to present Bitcoin as an alternative store of value, or just an alternative to the traditional financial system, which could be used as a hedge, it would have been a little bit too avant-garde. You explain the idea to people at that time, they really would not really get it and understand it. And so it's taken 10 years for the word Bitcoin to become more familiar, for people to see it either in a negative way, or in somewhat of a speculative way, that they've, watched Bloomberg and seen it's gone 2,000% increase, that it's either attracted speculative interest or has been somewhat controversial. And that's raised the level of awareness of Bitcoin more broadly. So that when we now go into this somewhat of a crisis at the moment, whether that's a financial, of course, there's a health crisis, but a subsequent financial crisis, that people have enough awareness of what Bitcoin is. They may have their own, let's just say, prejudice around what Bitcoin is. They may not quite understand the facts, but they can actually now appreciate its role this time around. And I think it's about the serendipity of knowledge and an event. And this is kind of that moment where there's enough time for people to have learned about Bitcoin, but here is a time where you can apply that learning, so to speak. Of course, that doesn't mean that it's fail-safe, but everyone who's involved in Bitcoin or have been involved in Bitcoin long enough know that there are peaks and troughs and that it is speculative. But for those people that don't quite understand Bitcoin, this is a moment to apply that understanding. And I don't think that happens very often. Whether it's a good or a bad thing, I think for everyone should understand that a portion of their wealth, at least a small amount at least, should be stored in an alternative asset. And it can't always be gold, because gold is not always movable, and it's gold even you cannot really control, because you've got to put it in a safe if there's any large quantity. But Bitcoin, you just need the internet and to keep a secret. It sounds simple but complicated in practice, but it gives an element of control that even gold doesn't offer.